Hi, my name is Gerry Whelan, for those of you who didn't get in before. And I'm going to talk about my career in emergency medicine and beyond. Um, and I've entitled my talk here Reflections from the Pasture. And where did I go right? Was it serendipity, opportunism, or just dumb luck, or all of the above? So I'm just a couple of caveats. My whole world in emergency medicine was long before COVID, so I really don't even know the world you live in anymore. But maybe what we talk about today will be a little respite from that. Not sure what I'm going to supposed to be doing, so I'm pretty much going to probably be rambling on like an old fart. And okay, so we were worried about a power failure, but that turned out to be nothing compared to what we had. So the first decisions I guess I made was in medical school. I had a connection through ROTC with the U.S. Air Force, and they early on, surprisingly, offered to sponsor me, pay all my books, fees, everything, and which was great because I had no idea how I was going to pay back my medical school loans otherwise. And that also put me onto a track to spend a lot of time of my career with the Air Force, which turned out to be a good thing. There was no emergency medicine rotation in medical school because there was no emergency medicine. And in fact, uh, so we used to, as first year students, go over to the ER at Kings County and kind of muck around, and they let us in. But basically, I came out of medical school very well set on going into a career in obstetrics. Um, and what happened was, whoops, so emergency medicine, WTF. Where did that come from? So I said, as I said, I wanted to do OB when I started my internship. To make a long story short, it was a bad scene because they had just legalized abortions, and there were some very horrible things going on that I was stuck with doing, and it turned me off to it. So I did get to moonlight in the emergency room at Brookdale Medical Center where I interned for $25 an hour. Yo! Um, but there was no emergency medicine. In fact, just as an aside, I was telling the group earlier that before EMS, people who needed to go to the hospital were taken there in the funeral parlor hearse. So talk about a conflict of interest. $50 if he makes it, $500 if he doesn't. Anyhow, while I was in that little ER, I found a throwaway journal with a story about a guy named Bruce Janiak, who would turn out to be one of my colleagues and friends in later years, who had cobbled together a program that he was calling Emergency Medicine Residency, and I believe it was in Cincinnati. So I thought that was inspiring. The next thing, I had to go and do 2 years as a flight surgeon, and flight surgeons don't actually operate on airplanes. They take care of people who fly airplanes. And it was really clinically dull. It was horrible. It was keeping the most healthy population in the world healthy. But I did get a moonlighting job, and that was an interesting story because I went over to a place called I forget, Burlington County Memorial Hospital, which was run by a guy named Winifred C. Betts, who had been there since Christ was a corporal, as they say. And I showed up one night, and I was all puffed out, and I said, I came here to work, to help you out. And he said, well, yeah, we don't need any help. So I just went, ah. Well, I said, can I stick around for a while? And he said, yeah, okay. And I can't even remember how they handled credentialing. And I came back every week for about 5 weeks. And then he said to me one night when I walked in, if you're going to keep coming, I guess we're going to have to pay you. So that was how I got my first moonlighting job. Also, at the end of my 2 years as a flight surgeon, I was going to be going for some kind of residency training. And I wanted to do emergency medicine. So I had to actually sit down and write a letter to the U.S. Air Force explaining to them what emergency medicine was and why they should invest several years of paying me to go someplace and study this specialty that didn't even exist. Well, I wrote the letter and they bought it. So I got to go into residency, and I interviewed every residency in the country, all three of them. This was 1973. And there was one in Cincinnati. Peter Rosen was going to start one in Chicago, and I interviewed in Los Angeles, and that's where I decided to go. The program had the department had been started by a guy named Gail Anderson, who was an OB, very reputable, built quite a reputation. And the school or somebody got a big grant to start like the first emergency department, and he came over to do that. Unfortunately, he never became an emergency physician, never worked a single shift ever in an emergency department. We had a program director named Bob Daly, but unfortunately he left after about 6 months. So we were called the Dirty Dozen. There were 12 of us, and there were some really powerful people who in the earlier years of emergency medicine made incredible marks. But we had virtually no faculty, and the program was only 2 years. And didn't work nights or weekends, if you could believe that. I did actually get to publish a paper in the forerunner of the Annals. It was a paper on the radiopacity of glass in soft tissue, and it was a really simple paper. I got it published, and I set up a hypertension referral program. So I was doing stuff when I was a resident. We also, by the way, got to take a chamber course in hyperbarics. There was a huge chamber out on Catalina Island, a multi-place chamber, and there were a lot of abalone divers out there who got bent all the time. So we went out there and we got trained about how to take care of them. And when we were on call, we'd get picked up by helicopters, and it was very exciting taken out to Catalina Island to do that. The other thing that was interesting in my residency, I took my hypertension screening program to the AMA as an exhibit, a poster exhibit. And Rick Bucata came along with me, and we were tapped, or I was tapped by some of the leadership of emergency medicine to go across town to testify at an AMA hearing where they were talking about authorizing curriculum guidelines for emergency medicine, which was a seminal step. And I got to testify because I was a resident and I had a tie, and Rick didn't have a tie, so he couldn't testify. And I got to stand up right behind a guy named Oscar Hampton, who was an arch enemy of emergency medicine, and tell the AMA why they should approve this. And they did, clearly because of me, I'm sure. So the residency was short, but it was an incredible hands-on experience like no place else in the world. Then I had to go back to the Air Force, and so I was kind of, they didn't know what to make of me. I went to Andrews Air Force Base, and they had a regional hospital there, so it was a pretty good high-sized hospital. And it also took care of civilian emergencies, so we had a pretty good mix of patients. One story is that they had in the emergency room a code button, and if a code came in, then the technicians were supposed to press the code button, and then all the real doctors would come down to take care of it. And we had the first code when after I got there, one of them headed toward the button. I said, "Don't you touch that button." So he didn't, and the patient came in, and it was a full arrest, and I was running a code. And the chief of staff of the hospital and the chairman of medicine came in and stood there with their arms crossed, hovering, just watching me. Never said a word, and then they walked out. And so that was kind of my baptism of fire. I also started wearing scrubs in the ER, which was unheard of. And then I would even wear them to meetings because I was a department chairman as well. So I also had some really good experiences there with the corpsmen and corps ladies. These were enlisted people, and they were like med techs. And I had a lot of fun training them. So we used to do things. I took Resusci Annie, everybody knows Resusci Annie, and I would drop her at the commissary or someplace, and have somebody say that the call in say that there was a patient who had collapsed and they weren't breathing. So they'd go out, and they could actually, at those days, they could take the ambulance with the lights and sirens, and they'd get there. So the first time they picked up Annie, they brought her back in, and they just kind of walked back into the ER and gave me a scowl. And I said, well, where's the patient? And they said, oh, she got better, she recovered. And I said, no, she didn't. I'm God, and I'm telling you, she did not recover. So they had to bring her in and go through the whole code, and that's how I got the nickname of God. I was called God for 3 years. It would sometimes confuse the patients when they put put a patient in the room and said, God will be in a few minutes. But they were so good. And one of them wrote a singing blues about Annie Rides Again. And they got so good. They loved it. And they got so trained up, and I had them reading x-rays, and they were just wonderful people. One of them went on to be a physician, and one went on to be a PA, so I was very proud of that. Also, while I was there, I was lent to AID, the Aid in Development, or whatever that is, the State Department, to go to Egypt for a month, and I spent a month over there trying to help the Egyptians to set up their very first EMT training programs. And it was a real experience. It was one heck of a culture clash. And I never got to get any follow-up and see how it went, but it was a real experience. I was having a good time there, and I was very happy with the Air Force, but I really wanted to be a program director. So I actually submitted a proposal to the Air Force to start a program at that little Air Force hospital there. And fortunately, they had the good sense not to do that, because it never would have worked. So, program director at last at the Great Stone Mother. It took a little while, because I was supposed to be getting a letter of invitation, or an offer from Dr. Anderson, the chairman, and he kept not sending it, and I had a friend there who kept bugging him, so he finally did. And so I came back to the Great Stone Mother, and I want to stop share for a second here, if I can. I want to hold up a picture. This is the Great Stone Mother, Los Angeles County USC Medical Center. And it was called the Great Stone Mother because nobody ever got turned away. We were the hospital of last resort, and we were very proud, and that's part of why I went back there. The program had 12 residents when I came back. I pretty quickly bumped it up to 18, and that was simply for scheduling purposes, because we had 18 rotations per year, or something like that. Anyhow, it had to do with numerology. Those of you who've done resident schedules know it's all about numerology. So I had to schedule all the residents, but I also pretty much had to manage and schedule all of the faculty as well, because the chairman didn't really do anything, and I was basically running the department from the time I got back there. One interesting piece of history in the past was we were recruiting residents pre-match. There was no match. So people would come and interview, and then we'd get their phone numbers. Nobody had emails in those days, or texts either. And on match day, you'd sit down with your list and get on the phone, and you'd call people. And they had to say yes or no, or they might say, well, I can't say because I'm waiting to hear from somebody else. And it was chaos. It was really chaos. And we did that for a couple of years, and then they finally brought in the match, which, as you know, makes it a lot easier, but I don't know if you can even imagine what that was like beforehand. So what else? While I was there, I got pretty much involved with ACEP. Actually, before I was there, because when I was still in the Air Force, I had founded a government services chapter in ACEP, National ACEP. The first time we met, there was myself and one other Navy doc, and nobody else showed up. But we hung in there. And now, actually, the government services chapter is close to the median-sized chapter in ACEP. So just hang in there. If things are slow to start, just follow your dream. I got very involved with Cal ACEP, which was a very active state organization, and was a counselor. Went to the national meetings, and I just loved being on the floor and the council and all the horse trading and all the what do you call it, procedures. Probably one of the most famous or infamous times I stood up was to, no, just be gentle with this, don't jump on me right away, to argue against 24-hour attending coverage in the emergency department. I won't go into why, but at that time we had residents who worked overnight and we did not have faculty. And we thought it was a good thing. We thought it was building character and giving them experience. And so you know how that turned out. They didn't exactly buy that. I did get invited to be an ABEM oral examiner pretty early on. As I recall, my examiner number is 072. So those of you who are examiners now, you can look at your numbers and see they're higher. And then I got nominated to ABEM and was elected to the board. Shortly after that, I had to take a little hiatus while I had some brain surgery. And I missed an ACEP meeting, National ACEP meeting. And one of the nicest things I can remember, they sent me a resolution passed by the entire council, wishing me well in a speedy recovery, and it was a touching thing. When I got on the ABEM board, one of the things that I most enjoyed was I got to be chair of the test administration committee, and which meant I was pretty much the head honcho for the oral exams, which those of you who are examiners know it's a wonderful experience. And I implemented a couple of things. One of them was what we called M&M, and I don't know if they still do it or not. But when all the examiners arrive and they're all in a room, there's 200 examiners or whatever, I would stand up and I would go over people's scoring from the previous exams to tell them why they were wrong. And I was facing 200 of the smartest clinical academic emergency physicians in the country, and I was going to tell them why they were wrong. So it was a real experience, but they were great. I just loved the oral exams. So the next chapter gets interesting. This is ER, the TV show. So you all remember the show that just, I was on for about 15 years. But when it first came out, I wrote a letter to the Los Angeles Times, and I tried to scan this, but it didn't work. So I'm going to hold it up for you if I can do this so you can see it. I don't know how well you can see that. And it says, put ER out of its misery quickly. And I just took it apart. And the reason I was so upset about it was because the story of ER, I don't know if a lot of people know this, is that Michael Crichton, wrote the original script. And he put it in a drawer. And about 15 years later, he took it out and dusted it off and said, okay, let's do a TV show like this. Well, in the meantime, emergency medicine had become a specialty, with residencies and attending staffs and supervision and everything else. And the portrayal, especially in that first episode, was of just chaos, where there were medical students and interns left alone, and there was no supervision. And so that was my bone to pick. And I suggested that they should actually call Dr. Kevorkian. So I got that one right, too, as you know, because ER was not a successful... Oh, I'm sorry, it actually was. It had a 15-year run. I did get a letter back from the medical director of the show asking for my input. And so while we started to do, the administration at the county hospital was very tight. And so we started smuggling in writers from the ER show. And the first one that came in on a Saturday night. And we had a section of the main ER called C booth. And it was where all the sick patients, whether they be trauma, cardiac arrest, overdoses, burns, whatever came. And as you know, usually when you have a very busy place and you invite people to come and see, nothing happens. And people are all standing around going, well, it's usually pretty busy. It's not like this usually. It's usually busy. Well, that night was just the reverse. It was the craziest night I ever had in my life. We actually had a patient come in with, I can't remember, was it a gunshot or a stab wound in the chest. And he wound up having a clamshell. And I don't even know if you guys know what a clamshell is. I've only seen it once in my life, and that was it. And that's where you do a bilateral thoracotomy and you open up both sides of the chest like a clamshell. And we actually got him out of the ER up to the OR, and he did die up there. But the floor was covered in blood. I'd never seen anything like it. And the poor little woman writer was over in the corner, and was she shaking? Was she crying? No, she was loving it. She was writing it all down. She was just couldn't get enough. So she was the first of several, And we would see things start showing up on the show. So we used to, most of our patients were malnourished, so we'd hang IV bags with vitamins in them, and they were yellow, and they were called banana bags. So we'd say, just hang a banana bag on that guy. And that started showing up in the TV show. We had a thing called a red blanket, where it was an expedited admission, and we threw this little red blanket on the gurney to indicate that, and that showed up. And if you remember, there was a woman physician and attending who walked with a cane and had a limp, and that was based on a Dr. Jane, who was in one of our faculty, who walked with two canes, actually. So I also got to visit the set and go out and walk around in it. And I will tell you, I moonlighted in the smaller ERs than that set. It was a 360-degree set, so you went into it, not onto it. And so in reality, I finally did realize that that show was a major draw for emergency medicine. I think there are hundreds or thousands of current emergency physicians who probably got their inspiration for going into emergency medicine from that show. So I've forgiven them. And also, I've gotten over the title, which was ER. There was a time, especially when I was on the Cal ACEP board of directors in California, we'd have board meetings, and there was a jar, and if you said ER or emergency room, you had to throw $1 in there, because we were very sensitive. It was emergency department, emergency physician. So we've gotten over that too. So I was managing to keep busy. We're doing on time. I did some ACEP symposiums and got invited to be an editor for the editions, and took a trip to Chile to introduce emergency medicine down there as well. And so let me come back to stuff that's a little more germane to cord people. One More Year, this is called. So we tried to have a fairly democratic program in a process of electing chiefs. And in any event, we had a 3-year program, and we went to a 4-year program. So to get from a 3-year program to a 4-year program, there has to be a year when the people who are going to graduate don't. And the first time we tried it, they lawyered up, and we had to back off. So we had to go back to making it really clear before people entered the program that it was going to be a 4-year program. So there was no way this was going to be easy. So we came to the time where they were going to have to do the additional 4th year, and morale, as you can imagine, was horrible. So I decided to try to do something to boost morale, and we planned a rafting trip on the Klamath River in Northern California. And all the 4th years, the new 4th years, were supposed to go. And I went, and the chairman of the department went. I think that was the only faculty. And some of them didn't want to go. So I said, well, okay, if you don't want to go, then you can do work shifts in the department. And the chief residents are going, oh my God, there's going to be blood in the streets. Da, da, da. And it came down to, I forget what the exact cutoff was, but I finally walked in one day and I said to the chief residents, okay, if they don't want to go, the hell with them. They don't have to go. They don't have to work shifts. And they just went, ah. And I think I just learned so much then about, pushing things to the point where you've got to recognize that, whoop, this maybe isn't working, so I got to back off. So I think I learned a lot from that. So I started looking around. I took a trip. I liked the county, but I wanted to see other pastures, and I took a trip to Boston, and I interviewed. And I did take a trip to Philadelphia, and interviewed with Dave Wagner and Jim Roberts, who were looking for somebody to be a program director they had a 2-hospital residency, so at the smaller hospital. But I didn't take either of those. I also did a little running away, so I did manage to get a sabbatical for 6 months, and I was working on some very cutting-edge technology then. I was working with something called laser discs, which were big discs that were bigger than a vinyl LP, where you could put images and things on. Now you probably had more capacity in a thumb drive. and I was going to have a complete selection of images for everything in emergency medicine. And I was working by myself, and it didn't work. So when I came back after the sabbatical, I did what 30% of people who take sabbaticals do, which was quit. Except it was not so easy because there was some fine print about if you take a sabbatical, you can't leave for so many years or whatever. But I went to the dean and copped a plea and got released. So I ran away for a year and I worked in a community hospital where, interestingly, I worked there half-time. They split a position with one other person. And I was making as much money there half-time as I was making at the county hospital full-time. But I really missed the teaching. I missed in the middle of the night when I had a really interesting case, having nobody to share it with, and I decided to come back. So I came back, and I also avoided the golden handcuffs. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, but I would see that with a lot of our residents who I used to encourage them. Sometimes I'd say, I would like to stay on as faculty. And I'd say, well, you need to go out and work for a couple of years, get some experience. And then 2 years later, I'd come back to them and I'd say, well, how about it? And they'd go, well, I'd like to, but I got this mortgage and I got these 3 cars and a couple of horses and I'm living in Palos Verdes and I can't afford it. So I never got caught with the golden handcuffs, fortunately. Then it gets nasty, the trauma wars. So it turned out the emergency department at LA County had a history of managing trauma and at the appropriate point call surgery. Well, the county decided to establish a trauma team, and they brought in a Greek trauma surgeon. His name was Dimitrios Dimitriadis, and he came from South Africa, and he was very, very qualified, but they were hungry to take over. We had an American College of Surgeons site survey while I was away for some reason, and it was a disaster. And when I came back, there were headlines in the Los Angeles Times that said, "Doctors fight turf battles at county hospital while patients die." So it got pretty nasty. And I was trying to hold it together so that we could maintain, the clinical experience that we needed for our residents and not have the trauma team just swoop down and take over everything, because they weren't nice. We even developed, they said, well, you have to do ATLS. And I said, no, we don't have to do ATLS. We can do an advanced trauma program of our own. And we developed one and did that for a couple of years. But then we finally had to do ACLS. At one point, I wrote a long, long letter to the American College of Surgeons and lost it on my computer. And it was, in retrospect, it was the best thing that ever could have happened, because it was such a vitriolic letter that it could have done no good. But just to tell you how ugly it used to get, when the trauma team would come down and our residents were intubating a patient, they'd come and splash betadine on the neck, on the anterior neck, and stand there with the scalpel. Talk about putting pressure on people. So that was not a good thing, and it was one of the things that I came home and complained about every night. So meanwhile, back at ABEM, I was on the board. I told you I was chair of chest administration, and I finally got to be president. I also got involved with the American Board of Internal Medicine, and that was a great experience too. I got on their executive committee. And then there was the Serendipitous Cab Ride. So I saw an ad in one of those little JAMA publications for something called Co-Director of Clinical Skills. Had no idea what that was. But it turned out I was on the ABEM executive committee, and we were meeting with the American Board of Internal Medicine in Philadelphia to discuss access to fellowship training in critical care for emergency medicine graduates, which we now have. And it turned out that the place that was advertising this was called the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, and they were a 15-minute cab ride away. So after the meeting, I hopped in a cab and I went and I sort of had an informal interview and was asked to come back with my wife. So I had to learn about OSCEs. I didn't know anything about OSCEs. This is my second WTF. and had never heard of them. So I did a literature review, and on the plane coming back, I had a stack of articles that I was reading about them. Had an interview with the president, who was a woman named Nancy Gerry, who had been the dean at the Armed Forces Medical School, USAF, before she took this job. Very, very tough lady. But anyhow, she offered me the job. She apparently had called my boss and had only asked one question. She said, can he get stuff done? And he said, well, yeah. And that was all she wanted to know. So I took that job, and that was a big move. It was a big move geographically, because we went from Los Angeles to Philadelphia. It was hard to let go, because I was, as you can tell, cared very much about the county hospital. But there was 17 years of stringing along. My chairman every year would say, well, I'm going to be retiring next year. And I was the heir apparent. And then he'd go, well, I just talked to my accountant, and it'd be better if I stayed for another year. And I went along with this for way too long. And as I said, the trauma wars were really wearing me down. I was getting to the point where I'd go to work, and I wasn't practicing emergency medicine. I wasn't teaching. I was just going to meetings, and I was fighting with the surgeons and the internists and the university and the county. So it all swelled up, and I decided it was time to make the move. So I did make the move, and I went to Philadelphia. And I came in to head up a team that had already started on developing this examination. So there was a lot of on-the-job training. It was a whole new field for me, how to learn about psychometrics and OSCEs and testing. So we finally put together what we call the Clinical Skills Assessment, which was the first high-step clinical skills exam ever in the U.S. It was only for foreign docs at that time. We called them FMGs then. Now they're IMGs. And we spent all of 18 months developing it. I arrived in September, and in February, Dr. Gerry said, well, are you ready to go with this a year from now? I said, yep, let's do it. And so we had to develop the exam with all the psychometrics and everything else, but we also had to build a test center. And if you've ever been to any of those testing centers, they're exactly like a clinic with 24 examination rooms fully equipped, and train all the standardized patients to learn their roles and how to score, and work with the architects and work with the IT people to develop programs and manage a big staff. But we did it, and we launched on July of '98, I think. So after a few years of doing that, the National Board of Medical Examiners, which was literally up the street, came down the street, and Pete Scholes from National Board and I actually met on a bench halfway between both places to talk about a collaboration. And so it was decided that there'd be a collaboration, so there'd be only one examination for U.S. and international graduates. And it was an incredible culture clash. Dealing with the National Board reminded me I was having PTSD about trauma surgeons, because they were just as haughty and pushy and wanted to take over. So there were a couple of stereotypes. And stereotypes are always not really accurate, but have some grain of truth. And so for the two organizations, the stereotype for the National Board was ever more precisely. So they would field test for 10 years and spend $10 million to change the reliability of an exam from 0.7 to 0.8. And so ever more precisely. On the other hand, our motto was close enough for government work. We had launched this thing in 18 months. And so it was really hard working with those people and finally coming to some agreement. So what we agreed was we needed to form a new entity. It was called the Clinical Skills E. I forget what the E is for, but a different entity. And we would also need a new executive director from outside of both organizations, because there was so much rancor. And so we hired somebody, and I put myself out of a job. So, I had to come up with a new job, and I did that for the last few years, where I was actually working part-time. And I developed an acculturation program. I was just teaching foreign doctors how to live and how to work in the U.S. and understand the U.S. healthcare system and things like that. on to the reflections. Remember I said there were going to be reflections from the Pasture? Well, I don't know. I don't have anything really great, profound to say. You know, these are all good, and in different situations, some of them really work. I really believe in not burning bridges. If you have somebody who's cornered and you give them a way out with honor, you'll have a friend for life. They can only say no. That's when I wrote to the Air Force and told them about this whole thing, crazy thing called emergency medicine, and they did it. Knowing when to back off when I was dealing with those residents about who didn't want to go on the rafting trip. But basically, my management principle was always hire good people and let them work. And carpe diem and follow your bliss is, pretty straightforward. Also, talking to program directors, residents are people too. They're really special people, and they can be a challenge. It's a unique relationship. I mean, there are residents that I worked with 30, 40 years ago who are just, come back to me and say, "Oh wow, it was just what you did was so great. It was so helpful." They're in a tough situation. It's almost kind of like a medical adolescence where they're not fully grown up, and they were more than fully grown up, and right now I think they're under a lot of pressure that I can't even understand, having to do with taking care of COVID and actually putting their lives on the line. But all I urge you to do is, as Crosby, Stills and Nash said, teach your children well, and remember that they're why you're there. A couple of things for individuals. Be kind. When in doubt, be kind. And stop and breathe. So I think more and more people are getting in touch with something called mindfulness. And if you haven't explored it, I really would encourage you to. I started a meditation practice about 6 years ago, and I wish I had had it many years ago in my busier years. And breathe, just stop, take a breath. Self-compassion is really, really important. And sometimes you think, well, I haven't got time for that. I have to be compassionate for everybody else. But those of you who remember flying in airplanes, they would say in case of a sudden case of loss of cabin pressure, the mask will drop down, and they always said, put yours on first before you put it on the kid. And it's the same principle. You got to take care of yourself. And spend time with your kids. My biggest regret, and I've told this to a lot of people, and I've told it to my kids, is when I was growing up, as you can see, I was very involved. When I was not growing up, when I was in my career, I was so involved with ACEP and ABEM and ABIM and chasing every golden ring that I missed a lot of soccer games and things where I should have been there, and you can never get them back. So I'd encourage you to order your life that way, and also spend time with your partner, even if you don't have kids. And at this point, I also, by the way, want to thank both my kids, and especially to thank my wife, Eileen, who was with me through all of this. Not always exactly with me, but was there and stood by my side and got me to where I was. So the elevators. My story is like the American dream. My parents were both Irish immigrants, first generation. I was the first in my family to reach something like medical school. My parents had high school education, GED at best. And there was a lot of, there was serendipity, there was opportunity, there was luck. But when I was talking with Marianne about this talk first, we were talking about the metaphor of the elevators. That I got on several different elevators at the ground floor or even in the basement, and then rode them up. But you know what? When I go back and I think about looking at those elevators, I now realize that those elevators had signs on them. And they had signs like white, they had signs like male, they had signs like doctor. And I realized that aside from all the serendipity and luck, I had a lot of privilege. And I maybe never would have gotten where I was except so many different kinds of privilege. And you have them too. I mean, I think you're all doctors. I can't see everybody, so I can't see how many people are of color and how many are male and female. but you have some of those elements of privilege, and you can't make that go away, and you shouldn't. But what I'm urging you to think about is just leveraging that. You are being listened to in a way you never were before. I wrote a little op-ed piece that didn't really go anywhere, but it was about the fact that everybody was pitching in as far as this pandemic is concerned. But I wanted to specially identify emergency physicians, because not only on the front line clinically, but you turn on CNN, MSNBC, even Fox, the vast preponderance of all the doctors they're talking to are emergency physicians. And it's kind of ironic that the specialty, which started off as the runt, is now so prominent and doing such a wonderful thing in terms of providing care and information. But you can use your privilege. You can leverage it. We need to have diversity in emergency medicine and all of medicine. Issues like equity in promotions and salary for people of color and for women. Patient access, we're working in those areas. So I just encourage you to realize you have got a lot of privilege and a lot of power, and there's a lot of work to be done in so many areas, and I hope that you'll use some of that. So this is what used to be my tagline on my emails from a Harry Chapin song, and I still stand by it. It's got to be the Goin, not the Gettin there, but it's good. But one other Harry Chapin line I'd like to throw at you and wish this on you. He's got a song called All the World's a Circle, and there's a line that says, "No straight lines make up my life, and all my roads have bends. There's no clear-cut beginnings, and so far, no dead ends." So with that, I would like to thank you. You are now my surrogates for emergency medicine. So on behalf of, with you being on, however that works, I want to thank emergency medicine, and you are emergency medicine right now, for a wonderful, wonderful career and a wonderful opportunity to move on and find a second career. And at that point, I'm going to stop, and I don't know if there are questions or comments or heckles or what you want to do.
If no one else has any questions, I think we may be able to wrap up this very exciting Zoom conversation. Yeah. I'm super happy we lost the slide decorator, and am highly apologetic, Gerry, for that happening during your talk. I do really want to thank you. This will be, obviously it's being recorded and will be available on the CORD website. So I really want to thank everybody for chiming in, as well as being able to be present for Dr. Whelan's talk.
And I have a theory. I think the Zoom bombers were trauma surgeons.
They were. That's yeah.
Pretty sure.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. Thank you again, everybody, and good luck with the combination of heat wave and COVID.